I don't like doing my own home repairs, and when I made some videos that honestly show how much I don't like it, they seem to help a lot of other guys like me. So I thought it would be good to make this new set of videos. Guys like me have a million questions for the progressive activists that we see on the news, but nobody on TV ever asks those questions. On CNN, the host probably agrees with the activists, so his questions are weak. And on Fox News, the host just tries to make them look bad. Either way, nobody's asking the questions that might actually help us get a feel for where they're coming from, so we might actually understand them a little better. It's no surprise that people who disagree over politics are so angry at each other nowadays. So right before Christmas, me and my brother, who is himself progressive, we drove around the West and did our own interviews. We drove to 22 cities and interviewed dozens of people who support progressive causes to ask those questions that are never asked. We're not trying to change their mind or make them look bad. We just want to understand where they're coming from. These folks were brave, considering what can happen nowadays if you say one wrong thing on YouTube. And we talked about a lot of really sensitive subjects. So just leave right now if these conversations might offend you. If you stay though, I think you'll hear some things you've never heard before and have a better understanding of your fellow Americans. I did. Next, we drove to Santa Fe and met Paul Gibson, founder and director of a consulting firm that for 30 years helped schools, nonprofits, city governments, and other public agencies improve the lives of folks in underserved communities. He started Santa Fe for Bernie, co-founded and runs Retake Our Democracy, and hosts a weekly show on KSFR Public Radio.
My name is Paul Gibson, and my wife Roxanne Barber and I moved to Santa Fe 5 years ago. And then the day that Bernie Sanders announced, we just looked at each other and said, in 5 seconds, Roxanne was on the computer getting the URL Santa Fe for Bernie, and we organized that campaign and coordinated it. That's how it started.
Haven't there been enough examples of failed socialism? Has that experiment not already been done?
Well, let's put it this way. I would argue that there are a lot of examples of socialist approaches in Europe and in Canada and other parts of the world that have been highly successful. And I would argue that the neoliberal policies of the United States that we've been practicing for the last 50 years have done nothing but decimate the working families, the poor. From 1970 to now, the growth of the economy has been like this, and the growth of workers' income has been flat. And over the last 50 years, we've seen an obscene accumulation of wealth under policies of both parties. And I would argue that it's time for a much more socialist approach. And I would also say that it's proving that while capitalism might work in the short term for a very small percentage of our population, for everyone else, it doesn't work at all.
So you were careful to say socialist, more socialist-oriented policies. Are you talking more about the kind of things that you see in like the Scandinavian countries, as opposed to the experiments in South America that are some of the places where socialism essentially means poverty, and basically poverty and an economy that is not based on fair trade, but an economy based on trading favors?
I would argue that in many of those South and Central American experiments, if you will, and in Cuba as well, if it hadn't been for U.S. intervention and subversion, they would have done just fine. I was at a movie last night on Guatemala. The director for the film was there, and I was able to talk to her. And it's very obvious that in 1980 they had a very democratic socialist kind of government down there, and that didn't work for Ronald Reagan. And what they got instead was genocide and a coup. And yeah, I guess you could say that's failed, but and now they have a lot of hydroelectric power, and it's vibrant, yes. And you know what they do with the hydroelectric power? They export it, and the people who live next to the hydroelectric power have no power, but their forest is being destroyed. That doesn't work for me.
So, and that's they're capitalists now. I mean, that's
okay. Not willingly.
Oh, okay.
Not willingly.
Okay, I see. So, are there any examples of a successful version of socialism? So, why do people keep trying? How do you answer a complaint like that?
I think I just did. I mean, if
okay, so there hasn't been a successful one yet on the planet because of all the interactions.
Well, and I would again say in Scandinavia and in Canada, there are a lot of socialist policies and practices and governments that are mostly progressively socialist, that are, depending on how you measure it. And I've heard Trump-type supporters say, yeah, but look at their taxes. And but if you look at things like what the UN does now to measure what they call happiness quotient, those people are off the charts happy, and they don't live in fear that they're suddenly going to be bankrupt or homeless. They don't live in fear that if they lose a job, they're going to suddenly have nowhere to turn, because the society is structured in such a way that it's much more about trying to help each other and support each other, and that's the kind of culture I want to live in.
Here's another. You have tremendous expertise and experience in something that's near and dear to my heart: assimilation versus having pride in your heritage. Mm-hmm. Because I remember the stories of my granddad moving into an American neighborhood so his little kids wouldn't have accents. So to me, and to I think a lot of Italian Americans, it's like, hey, dude, it works. I mean, that's what works.
There's some people, and I'd cite the indigenous people in this state, who don't want to give up their culture and don't give a good goddamn about advancing in this culture and this economy and in this social framework. So I would say the problem with your analogy is that America has been predicated on an assumption that was, came out of religion, that Christians were right and that the savages needed to be tamed or killed, and that they were doing a good thing in doing that. They were saving them. And I'm sorry, manifest destiny and our entire approach to America First, which is Trump's big slogan, to my mind is nothing but hubris, arrogance, and a myopic view of the world that just doesn't even look at what can be learned from other cultures and other peoples.
When we see folks who did like my ancestry did, which is to become more American, become more of the melting pot. They did what, it's funny because there used to be words for this that are no longer used because they're out of favor. But there's a new word for it now. They call it the millennial, the millennial progress sequence? No, the millennial success sequence. Have you heard about that?
No.
Millennial success sequence. People who graduated from high school, got a job, got married, and had kids. And if you follow that sequence, you will have an 86% chance of being middle class or better. When folks are now embracing this millennial success sequence, it reminds me a lot of, I say, good goodness, this is just like, it's just like when my dad, grew up without an Italian accent, and when Barack Obama made sure he had a crease in his pants. There's what you want to do, what the pure thing to do is, and then there's what works. It's all playing the game. And a lot of people say playing the game is selling out, when in the past it was just considered, okay, this is how the melting pot works. What's your response to that?
I'd say you've bought into being a cog in a wheel that benefits a lot of other people a whole lot more than it benefits you. And you're willing to eviscerate your own culture, get rid of your accent, so you fit in a culture that maybe needs to adjust more to you than vice versa. And I would say that that millennial success sequence that you're talking about is kind of a privileged perspective. I'm imagining that part of that also is, get your education, so that means college. So if you come from a middle-class family...
Well, not necessarily. The success sequence is only high school. If you still get the 95% correlation or coefficient. Well,
I would still say that it sounds to me like someone who has bought into a system.
No, I agree. Granted, it is a very bourgeois thing. It's a thing that the 60s are all about rejecting.
I would say that, you're talking about the 60s and we tore down some walls. We didn't get everywhere, but the civil rights movement was part of the 60s. People aren't lynched. Now they're just shot in the streets by police. But I would argue that women's rights made great advances. We've had great advances in LGBTQ. We've had great advances in relation to, obviously through civil rights, as I mentioned. But we needed to have torn down more walls. One of the things that is the most frustrating for me in civic conversation is the degree to which very conservative people foist basically what I would call myths out there as justifications and don't really examine facts and don't really examine. My whole career was predicated on doing research. I was a consultant to a lot of different social service and health systems, and I would have to come in and write grants for them, but I wasn't an expert in their field. So before I would go to the first meeting, I would have to do all the research on what is evidence-based practice for that field. And I would know more about it than the people who were the practitioners, because practitioners were so busy doing the work, they never had time to go back and reflect on the research, or not as much time as they needed. And I would say that so much social service and so much, not social service, social policy is predicated upon the short-term benefits and but not on the long-term gains.
But isn't it, it's a cliche that almost everyone who goes into social work at some point will say the saddest thing about social work is how for people who need the most help work to their own disadvantage because of cultural issues.
You said it was a cliche.
But I mean,
that's another. You're just proving my point.
Okay. Well, is there any truth in it?
No.
There's no truth. I mean, you didn't see anybody who would have done better not to walk into the courtroom with a pimp stroll, or who would have done a lot better with a crease in his pants, as President Obama had, versus a backwards cap and baggy jeans.
Well, it's always good to talk about anecdotes. And what I would say is a more constructive way to look at that situation right there is, how did that person get to that point where they had so little faith in their prospects and their future that they didn't give a damn? If you grow up in a culture where most of the men have gone to jail or prison, you don't see, and where none of your peers come back from college or go to college, how do you bolster up the energy and the stamina to be that millennial success story? I mean, there are so many factors that are undermine people in communities that have been underserved and under-resourced. Take a look at what happened right after World War II. We decided we were going to invest in the middle class. And so that's where mortgage loans were made available, and blacks were not eligible. They were redlined right out of the business. And so while whites grew in their wealth, and they owned homes, and they traded their homes, and they moved up in class, and they moved up in income and in wealth, right now it's projected by researchers that in another 10 years, the average wealth of an African American will be zero.
Yeah. Well,
zero. And it's not because they wear baggy pants.
The success sequence is without regard to any other factors, race, whatever. Now, I think purists would want everyone to retain their ethnic identity to, 100%, without any compromise at all. There's a word for that, balkanization, right? We see what happens when there is no attempt to assimilate into a larger culture. Now, this is something that, for hundreds of years, the folks that would handle immigration, for example, would carefully balance the amount. They would talk about the rate of immigration and the rate of assimilation. So these are not new issues. These are issues that we've dealt with in the past, and the way we've dealt with them in the past is we've said, at some point we need to have an American identity, and that American identity is something worth aspiring to. It may be pedestrian, it may be common, it may not celebrate. I mean, you may not celebrate in your workplace the fact that, you're 3/4 Cherokee Indian and 1/4 Irish. You may celebrate it at home, but at work, we've kind of had this thing where, hey, we're just kind of all pulling in the same teams. We're not celebrating that in a place where you're public facing. And even now, with the NFL. The argument against the NFL folks taking a knee is, look, do that on their own time, do that in a public place, but not at work. Because this thing about work and at work, you do whatever the customer wants you to do.
And they also say, don't bring up anything at Thanksgiving, and they don't. And we just had an instance here where there's this there's a celebration that's offensive to many people that was conducted in Santa Fe. It's been going on for almost 100 years, and it's an offense. And so what was Santa Fe's response to that? They suspended free speech at the plaza and herded all the natives off to what they call the free speech zone. So it's appropriate to express your views as long as it's not inconvenient to the people who are viewing it, and that's the whole point. So when you say that those football players can go and express themselves at home, what impact does that have? What visibility does that have? Do you tell Trump that he should, not express his views in a press conference? That's his milieu. The NFL, that's on a football field. They have a possibility of having somebody go, and
no, that's fair enough. I can respect that. You're right. The president does it while he's on the job, so.
Right.
But it's not something that most people have the freedom to do.
The president also doesn't.
I can't editorialize at my work, for example.
Then you should look for a different job. You could have if you worked for me. The other thing I would argue is not many of Donald Trump's friends and family members have been gunned down by police or have been incarcerated by in private prisons for 20 and 30 years and rotting away. And when that's the situation, maybe our society ought to expect people to raise inconvenient truths.
I remember when the majority were big believers in the millennial success sequence, right? It was kind of expected. And of course, the 60s kind of did away with a lot of that, along with changing a culture that I thought was worth preserving by and large. Because, what comes when you start having sex and kids before you get married, statistically anyway, without regard to race, then that's when your children are more likely to live in poverty, that's when you're more likely to live in poverty, and all those things. So I think we did throw the baby out with the bathwater during the 60s to an extent.
Well,
would you agree that?
No. I mean, once again, I would say that just with your analogy or your example of the black kid coming into court with the baggy pants, there's a reason why people wind up having kids before they, get through college and stuff like that. I mean, there's a lot of social forces and a lot of cultural forces and a lot of closed doors that don't give people a whole lot of sense that there's much out there for them. And sure, you can always point to Barack Obama and creased pants, but the exception doesn't necessarily prove the rule. And I would argue that, I don't know your millennial success research, so it's hard for me to argue with it. But you were just referencing the 60s was a pretty good culture. And as a male, I imagine it was. A white male, I'm imagining that for the hundreds of millions of American women who did 90% of the work at home unpaid, raised the kids unpaid, had no prospects for employment, but if they did, they could be a teacher, lowest paid job around, professional job anyway, or a nurse, second lowest paid job, a professional job around at the time. Then there's always social work. And so, we're making progress there, but women still only make, 60 or 70% on the dollar to men. and have many doors closed to them.
I agree with you. I think all those
I mean,
things.
have you looked at any of those photo shoots of these Republicans crowing about whatever they're trying to do in Congress? You look at the photo, and it's like white male city, all with creased pants.
Right.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't buy into that.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a huge dividing line.
And I want to get back to one thing that we've sort of walked around. You talked about socialism. I mean, I would like to talk about capitalism for a minute. Capitalism is predicated on growth. Well, growth is predicated on consumption of resources and production of consumer goods. Otherwise, there is no growth, correct? It's indisputable that we are running out of resources and we have no place to put all the garbage we produce. And we don't need 90% of it. Yet, if we don't consume, if we don't go out there on Black Friday, if we don't go and, everybody is paying attention to how shopping is going right now. If that doesn't work, the whole economic model fails. And the economic model is completely unsustainable. So there needs to be some reflection on, if that's not the model, what is the model? And in a capitalist society, in a colonialist dominated society, in a sexist and a racist society, the public debate is narrowed to the head of a pin. And anything out there, and this is what is socialism or it's communism, what we have right now is social Darwinism. If you can't crease your pants, if you can't pull up your pants, if you can't play the game the way you're talking about playing the game, you're going to get squashed like a bug. And frankly, that's not the kind of society. First of all, even if that's the kind of society that worked in the 18th and 19th century, it cannot work any longer. It has to be time for cooperation and community.
You're saying because of the resources?
Because of the resources, if for no other reason. Okay. For social justice reasons, I also think it's important. But for environmental survival, it's essential.
If I can, all of those things that you described, they sound like wonderful things. What worries me is that I don't think any of them adhere to the rules of human nature that would require, there would need to be a different set of humans on the planet for those kinds of things to work. And what I'm referring to is, of course, capitalism is in which everyone is fending for themselves. Everyone is out for themselves. And historically, that has been the thing that's led to more people getting more wealth.
No, to less people getting more wealth.
Well, certainly there are some people who gather
and to destroyed cultures and destroyed planet and destroyed people. Okay, I'm sorry. If you look at it, capitalism has been the framework where growth and accumulation of profit trumps the benefit of communities.
Okay, so when the Russians sent their best and brightest here to study economics and then brought them back and put them in charge of setting prices in Russia, it didn't work. The way the free market, of course, works is that everybody has an incentive to be as cutthroat and as ruthless and as greedy as possible.
Right.
And it's only in doing that we get, things that are coming to us from Amazon, the very next day, or that we get an iPhone 6. Those are the reasons that we get these things, is because people we've incentivized accomplishment.
So your iPhone was largely produced by cheap Chinese labor, some of them living in what they call dormitories. You could call it a work camp, earning, maybe 20 cents an hour or something like that. So yeah, it worked out real well for you and for me with my iPhone. But, at what point do we... You say it's not human nature. I would argue that human nature has become perverted. If you want human nature, we may be better suited looking at how indigenous people lived before we came and started ruining their lives. I was just reading an article about some of the settlers in the Northeast here. When they encountered the natives, they were infuriated because they weren't industrious. They were living in harmony with the earth. They had a robust, sophisticated agricultural system that was in balance with the earth. and they spent a good deal of their time sitting around talking with each other. And that infuriated these people because it was like they should be busy. Well, their human nature was not to be going like, oh, we've got to go and like just make a little bit more. And if I like cut out my brother-in-law over there, I could make even more corn for me. That's not the way they thought, and that's not what human nature was. You know, I'm not going to concede what human nature should be or is. When human nature is formed by the conditions in which they live, your understanding of human nature may be what the tortured human nature that has been derived from now centuries of working in a cutthroat world. And I have no sense that Donald Trump has any sense of doing anything other than saving himself. And that is the perfect expression of capitalism, and where it's all about me, and I'm going to do fine, and I'm not terribly worried about, you know, the fact that I make 10,000 times what the people who work for me make. And if things start to go south on one of my investments, I'll just declare bankruptcy and walk away. It's so much a part of our culture that you call it human nature. It's a normalized behavior now. That's what you're supposed to do. My business isn't going well. I don't get together with all the people who have been part of it and try and figure out how we all work together. I save my ass. And that's capitalism. I prefer to believe in a different human nature.
So ends this interview in our Drive to Understand series. I'm so happy he gave a forceful defense of what folks call nowadays the salad bowl or cultural mosaic approach to the American identity. And that's a debate we really need to have in this country, but which other interviewers seem to avoid at all costs. And when a guy who's worked for decades trying to improve the lives of people in failing schools and neighborhoods, like Paul Gibson has, when he says that conservatives too often justify policies with myths instead of facts, that's something I want to know to avoid that in my own arguments. I hope you may want to support this series by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks.